What the heck is going on in alien Earth? Today I'd like to dig through some of the theories that actually make a fair bit of sense, and some that don't. Perhaps the most outrageous and unlikely theory I've seen so far is that Mauro is actually David. The idea here starts with Mauro talking to Slightly and Smee in the omelet room in episode 3. He tells the two hybrids about the Maginot, and specifically about how his crew found eggs on a faraway moon. And not just any eggs, but the Xenomorph eggs. Ovomorphs are the technical name, by the way. Anyway, this leads us to an obvious question. What moon is he talking about? It could, and most likely is, LV-426, where the Nostromo crew will find their very own batch of eggs 2 years after the events of Alien Earth. However, it could also be a different moon, perhaps one settled by David after the events of Alien Covenant. Another clue comes later in the episode when Mauro is talking to Slightly through that weird fingernail implant that he secretly places on Slightly's neck in the omelet room. Here he ends their conversation with, quote, "Don't let the bedbugs bite," which, apart from being a chilling thing to say to a child, is also what David said to Daniels before she entered cryosleep at the end of Covenant. This was also the last time we ever saw David, and likely the last time he'll appear on screen, given that Ridley Scott is unlikely to ever finish his Prometheus series. So what if David does return, albeit without Michael Fassbender in the role? It could be that Mauro, in his adventures with the Maginot, stumbles upon David on some distant moon. There, through some sci-fi mumbo-jumbo, David transfers his mind into the body of Mauro. Why he would do this is easy enough to write off. Perhaps his body had been damaged, and he requires a new host, for lack of a better term. We know that Mauro can transfer data directly into his brain, as seen in episode 3, so perhaps it's possible for a super-intelligent synth like David to come up with the technology necessary to transfer his mind into a cyborg body. After all, if some trillionaire teenager can do it, so can David. This would explain why Mauro knows so much about the Xenomorph, after having spent years studying them on Origai 6. He even tells Yutani over the phone that these creatures are his life's work. Of course, as I initially alluded, this is a pretty flimsy theory. Sure, it fits the timeline just fine, but it raises narrative questions and is even contradicted by other moments in the show. For one thing, it would mean that there's a separate technology to transfer a synth mind into that of, for all intents and purposes, a human host. That's a kind of tech that would have to be invented by David because it sure as heck doesn't exist on Earth, where the concept of transferring a human mind into that of a synth is considered revolutionary technology. There's also the matter of Mauro calling Yutani. It makes sense that Mauro, as the ultimate company man, would do that, but for David to do it strains credulity. I'm not even sure how he'd have the code unless he just has access to all of Mauro's memories. Beyond that, Mauro also mentions that he had a daughter, suggesting he is exactly who he says he is. Again, you could argue that David simply has access to those memories or he's lying, but that seems like a big narrative leap when the simpler answer, that Mauro is just a new character with a long-gone family, is the more likely and logical conclusion. Then there's the meta-analysis. Noah Hawley has stated that the prequels aren't useful to his vision of Alien Earth. He's basically thrown out all of the backstory created in Prometheus and Alien Covenant in favor of his own interpretation. That doesn't necessarily mean that those movies aren't canon, just that it's incredibly unlikely that we'll see any continuation of that story in Alien Earth. Still, it's an interesting theory, and one that's particularly enticing for those who enjoyed what Ridley Scott was doing with his prequels. Unfortunately, it's also almost certainly complete bunk. A more likely theory is that Wendy is the source code for future synths, like Bishop in Aliens, Andy in Alien Romulus, and Thea in Predator Badlands. The idea here stems from another theory that's borderline just the plot of the show, that the hybrids aren't real hybrids after all, and that the terminally ill children's minds weren't transferred into their synthetic bodies at all. Instead, their minds were copied into synthetic brains, with the children themselves dying in the process. Which is super depressing. Think of it kinda like the transporter technology in Star Trek. When Kirk and his team are being beamed up to the ship, are their atoms being broken down, sent through space, and reconstituted on the ship, or are they simply being copied over to the ship with their original bodies being disintegrated and therefore killed in the process? It's similar to what a lot of folks think is happening with the hybrids. But back to the theory. We know that there's a jump in synthetic technology at some point after the events of Alien. In the sequel, Aliens, Bishop being an android causes Ripley to freak out due to her interactions with Ash from the Nostromo.
Just stay away from me, Bishop. You got that straight?
You'll recall that he tried to shove a porno mag down her throat, so she has some issues with synths. Bishop asks what model Ash was, to which Burke explains that it was the Hybridyne Systems 120A2. Bishop states that, quote, the A2s always were a bit twitchy. That could never happen now with our behavioral inhibitors. It is impossible for me to harm or by omission of action allow to be harmed a human being. It could be that after we find out that Wendy's mind is just a copy, things go a bit wonky. Perhaps she rebels, and perhaps even causes some sort of havoc at Neverland. It could very well be, based on what we've seen so far, that the inevitable downfall of Prodigy isn't due to a xenomorph, but the hybrids themselves. It could be that this leads to Wendy's mind being used to create a more human synth, albeit with inhibitors to stop them from causing harm. This would fit in with the current continuity just fine, since presumably Ash is an older model by just a few years. With just 2 years between the show and Alien, there's plenty of stuff on Earth that would have been missed by the Nostromo crew, such as a major new update in tech. Again, this one is a little flimsy once you try to explain it, and frankly, I think we're still missing some important details to come in later episodes. But it's at least plausible that Wendy has a major influence on synthetics going forward. In episode 3, we get a look at a selection of articles, one of which states, Wunderkind and CEO of the newly minted Prodigy Corporation, Boy Cavalier, showed off his latest exercise in synthetic human beings. Boy Cavalier has indicated that the progress made came as a direct result of throwing himself into his grief after the death of his... and it trails off. Unfortunately, Mauro doesn't click on this article, so we never see what death caused Boy Cavalier's grief. We can assume, however, that it's probably a family member. Some theories suggest it was a sister, hence him creating Wendy, but still others suggest it was his parents. If the latter theory is correct, then it could be that Kirsch is actually a synthetic version of Boy Cavalier's father. That's pretty much it as far as that theory goes. I got nothing else. Finally, there's my favorite theory. This is another one that really doesn't necessarily have an effect on the Alien timeline and seems more plausible than, say, the Mauro is David theory. The idea is simple. What if Prodigy goes through the same process used to create the hybrids, but instead of transferring a human mind into a synth, they transfer a human mind into a xenomorph? I know, it's a crazy idea. But remember that Cavalier wants to create essentially a supreme intelligence. I'm not sure how he'd carry out a conversation with a xenomorph exactly, but in his warped little mind, this could be exactly the answer he's been looking for. Xenomorphs are often referred to as the perfect organism, and if Cavalier sees it that way, then it is entirely possible that he makes an attempt to carry out the ultimate mind transfer experiment, which will absolutely lead to disaster. Now, I should note that at the time of making this video, we're only 3 episodes into Alien Earth, so there's plenty of material left to prove these theories wrong. And heck, some of them are already straining credulity. I would dare say all of them are. But hey, that's internet theorizing for you. Let me know your craziest Alien Earth theories in the comments, and until next time guys, thank you for watching ScreenRant.